positive, not IgG. Okay, so what does that tell you? Right off the bat, what does that tell you? Without looking at anything else, what does that tell you? That it's more than likely complement because you don't have the complement antisera. But if it's not IgG, chances are real good it's complement. What do you know about complement? Okay, but more general when it comes to when you're talking about antigens and antibodies and blood bank. I'm sorry? Not necessarily. I mean, it could be. But if it's complement, it is usually
C3D.
C3, but what's the antibody?
It's an antibody.
Not necessarily the specific antibody, but the general antibody.
Oh, which IG?
It is a what? You guys have to like.
Is it IgM?
It's IgM, and what do we know about IgM? Okay, it's first response, but generally blood bank antibodies that are IgM, what do they do?
Work at room temperature.
Very good. They like colder temperatures. So they like room temperature, which of course is colder than your body, or sometimes they like refrigerated temperatures, right? So for this top one, we know that direct Coombs is positive. It's not IgG. So chances are really good that we're dealing with a cold. It could be an autoantibody. But remember, it's probably an artifact because your body is not going to be 22 degrees. If you are, you're probably dead. So when your body is nice, toasty, warm, 37 degrees, the antibody most of the time doesn't react, unless you have right now it's a phenomenon where it gets tingly in your fingers and that kind of thing. Okay? So that being said, look at your screen cell. What does the screen cell tell you?
It's only reacting at room temperature.
It's only reacting at immediate spin room temperature. So what does that tell you? We're probably dealing with the cold antibody. Okay, so we've got a direct Coombs. It's positive, not IgG. Looks like a cold. We've got a screen that's positive at room temperature, goes away at 37, nothing there at Coombs. Okay, that's positive. If it reacts on any cell at any phase, it's still a positive screen. Okay. So if we think that the antibody that's in the plasma is a cold reacting antibody, and the antibody that's on the patient's cells is a cold reacting antibody, do we think this could possibly be the same antibody that's the culprit in both cases?
Yeah.
Come on, Chris, let's be forceful and come out with that answer. Yes, we do, because there should be, I mean, it's possible there's two different, but most likely it's the same. So what do we need to do? Do we need to do anything? Those of you who had ABO discrepancies, what did we do?
Repeat. You have to discover what the discrepancy is.
And you figure out what it is. How are we going to figure out what it is?
Well, determining what step the discrepancy occurs.
Okay, well, we know that. It happened at immediate spin and the complement.
DAT for complement.
Well, we could do the DAT for complement, but chances are real good that that's what we're dealing with. I mean, you might have an IgA or an IgE or an IgD direct Coombs. For the most part, it's going to be complement or IgG. Okay, so What we have to do is, our hypothesis is that we have a cold reacting antibody, and the same cold reacting antibody that's reacting on the screen cell is reacting so that it's coating the patient's cells. We need to prove it. How are we going to prove it?
Do a full antibody screen.
We'll do an antibody screen. Well, this is a screen, but we may have to do it at a different temperature, right? Maybe we want to put it in the refrigerator and see if it gets stronger. It's already 2+, so it's probably not necessary. Because it looks like we've got a pretty nice cold antibody going on there. If we warm this up, it goes away, right? So a lot of times if you have a cold reacting antibody, you warm it up, you just skip that immediate spin, and you go straight to 37. Because only 37-degree antibodies are going to be significant. Room temperatures are just, artifacts that we have to contend with. So we could, if we wanted to, put it in the refrigerator and see if it got colder. We could use cord cells, because we know that cord cells are not big I positive, but most adult cells are big I positive, and that is the antibody that we deal with as a cold reacting antibody most of the time. So we could put it in the refrigerator, put some cord cells in there. Depending on what the patient's blood type is, that could be an anti-H. A1s, A1Bs have anti-H. Sometimes they have anti-IH, which all those are cold reacting antibodies. And it's really nice to know that that's what we're dealing with. But basically, just knowing that we're dealing with a cold should be sufficient in most cases, because actually identifying the cold reacting antibody is academic. So this was one of the questions off your test. So if you see it again, you've got it right here in front of you, and you can figure out what testing you're going to do and what your interpretation is going to be. And I'll tell you like I tell my children, because you are my children, right? Be sure to answer all the questions. Okay? So if there's 3 questions there and you answer 2 of them, you haven't completely answered all the questions. All right, so let's look at the next one. Anybody have any questions about that one? Everybody good on that one? Okay. What's our ABO type?
That we're on this one here?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm not sure.
Okay, don't look at the stuff underneath the A2 cells and the A1 lectin itself, but just look at the blood type.
I mean,
Okay, we don't know what it is, right?
Yeah.
You don't know.
What are the possibilities?
Could be A, could be,
Could be an A subgroup with anti-A1, right? Could be Rouleau.
yeah.
Could be a cold reacting antibody. So this antibody up here could be, could be something similar. These are 2 different patients, but it could be something similar. So it could be a cold reacting antibody. Could be an A subgroup with anti-A1. Could be Rouleau. Okay? If it's an A subgroup with anti-A1, what do we do? There's a triad that we have to do if we think we have an A subgroup with anti-A1. A1 lectin. And what does A1 lectin need to be? If we think we have a subgroup, no. If it's positive with A1 lectin, you've got an A1.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. So if we've got an A subgroup, if we think we've got an A subgroup with anti-A1, what's our A1 lectin going to be? Negative. Okay. What's the other 2 things we have to do? We have an A subgroup. B. You test it with A2 cells, and what does it do with A2 cells? Doesn't react. Okay. And what's the third thing that you have to look at? You have to do a screen. And what does the screen need to be? Negative. Okay. So that's your triad when you think you have an A subgroup. You test it with A1 lectin. A1 lectin is negative, saying it's an A subgroup, most likely an A2. Test them with A2 cells. Doesn't react with A2 cells, so that's going to be negative. and then you look at your screen, because the other thing that can cause it to be positive is a cold reacting antibody. So if you've got a positive screen, especially if you have a screen like this one up here, you could have a cold reacting antibody. So you could theoretically have somebody who is an A subgroup with a cold reacting antibody if your A1 lectin is negative. So you have to discern what's actually giving you the problem. All right, so those are the two. What's the third thing? What do we do for rouleau? Saline replacement. So basically you spin the cells down, you take off the supernatant, you replace it with an equal volume of saline. If it's true agglutination, the agglutination will persist. If it's due to rouleau, which is just a lot of protein, it'll go away and you've proven rouleau. Okay, so that would be your other thing. All right, so let's go to the second one where it has your A2 cells. A2 cells are 2+. Does that seem like that's going to be an A subgroup with anti-A1? What did we say it had to do with A2 cells?
Should have been negative.
Should be negative. This one's positive. What about our A1 lectin? Positive. So do we think we have an A subgroup here? No, probably not. And then we have pooled O cells, and they're 2+. So what do we think this is? It's an antibody. What kind of antibody? It could be, but not necessarily. Probably not, because it's reacting with your O cells. So no, that's not. There's no such thing as an anti-O. It's a cold reacting antibody. Okay, so that was the second option out of a 3. So when you look at the big picture of your reactions, it can lead you down the path of being able to discern what your reaction is due to. And then you go about proving it. How do you think you would prove this? If our hypothesis is it's a cold reacting antibody, how do you think you would prove it?
Antibody screen.
Well, in essence, the pooled O's is sort of an antibody screen. I'm sorry, what?
A warm wash.
You could warm it up. You wouldn't necessarily need to wash it. You could just put it in the heat block and get it to 37 degrees. And most of the time, if it's a cold, it should go away, or at least gets substantially weaker. And then you've basically proven that you've got a cold antibody. So these were not meant to be the same patients, but they kind of blend in with each other. Okay. Now the third one. What is our interpretation on the third one?
Transfusion?
It's what?
Transfusion.
Yeah.
It probably is a transfusion. How do we know?
A mixed field.
Hmm?
This is a mixed field.
You've got a mixed field, so you've got a dual population going on. Okay, so you've got a sea of free cells with a few agglutinates floating through. So you've got it reacting with some and not reacting with others. So we have a mixed field, you've got something else that's causing another population to be present. And in this case, transfusion is very, very likely. So
Is
what
it
we need to do.
possible Also, if the mother was pregnant or something? Not necessarily?
Sometimes you get that. I mean, we get some contaminated specimens that, that when they collect it, they, get the fetal blood and the maternal blood kind of mixed in because it's in the cord and everything. But most of the time, if you had somebody who wasn't transfused and you had a mixed field, you might go and have another specimen collected so that you've got a clean slate to start with. I have situations where the mother's an O negative and the baby is an A positive, and the A and the D are mixed field. So you know that that's probably where it's coming from. But it's nice to, prove it and not have to make too much of a leap of faith. Okay, so we think on the last one that we've got a transfusion. So that's very simple to figure out, right? What do we have to do to figure out that's a transfusion? Look in the history. Okay, have they been transfused? What happens if you don't have any knowledge of whether they've been transfused.
Wash the cells.
Hmm?
Wash the cells.
You could wash the cells.
Get another drug. Get another.
Well, you could get another specimen because that's what we did with the babies. What we do a lot of times is I go into the history and go and see, were they a transfer from another hospital? Because if they're transfers from another hospital, a lot of times they may have been not have been transfused at Shands, but they've been transfused in Valdosta or Tallahassee or wherever they've sent them to us from. So a lot of times that's where we get our history.
So what if they just show up? They can't, obviously they're unconscious and you have no history.
It's always safer to err on the side of safety. That's kind of redundant, isn't it? If you cannot document that they have gotten any blood anywhere and you get these kinds of reactions, it's always safer to just go ahead and give them O negatives, because that way, if there's something funky going on that we haven't figured out yet, you're not going to muddy the waters too much more.
So
You've already got a mixed field.
If they were transfused in that type of scenario, how long would you wait until you can determine what they are? Would this mixed field would basically fix itself?
A red cell has a life expectancy of 120 days. Truly, you don't end up needing 120 days. It's usually within maybe a month and a half or so, because the blood units that are transfused have a 70% viability for 45 days, 42 days. So you would expect a good portion of them to have sort of been cleared out of the system after about 6 weeks.
So could you feasibly transfuse them that long?
Oh yes. Oh yes. We have patients in the hospital who stay in the hospital for a very, very long time, and they get blood very often. Sometimes they go home and come back, but they get a lot of blood. So at some point in time, we would like to find out, like if he came in and he was unresponsive, as soon as he comes out of his coma or his delirium or whatever he's in, then if we can get a history from the family member or from him or whatever, then we can go back and revert back to the A. And this one, A positive. I had a very interesting case one time because we have O negatives in some of our satellite refrigerators, but our policy is we give O positives to men and women over 60 years old. So if they come in and they get an emergency blood that's uncross-matched, and they're a woman who's over 60 or a man, they get O positives. We don't waste our O negatives, and that's pretty much common practice at level 1 trauma centers. So, but we have these satellite refrigerators that have O negatives. So this patient came in, and he got some O negatives out of the satellite refrigerators, and then he came to the emergency room, and we gave him O positive because he was male, and then they drew a sample. So then it's like, oh, I have an A mixed field and a D mixed field. Okay, so I'm pretty sure the patient's an A because I didn't give him any A's, so I'm pretty sure the patient's an A. But this mixed field on the D, we gave him O negatives and we gave him O positives, so who knows what he really truly is, right? And that was one of those cases where I went in the history, found where he'd been transferred from, called them, he was an A positive, we made him an A positive, and off we went on our merry little way. Okay. The question that we had the extreme fighters, which was the last question, that was one of those where, if you have, I don't know if anybody caught on that one of the extreme fighters was Amy and the other one was, I forget what his name was, but it was male, very obviously male. So in certain cases, if you're a level 1 trauma center, and actually that's one thing that they'll tell you, don't waste your O negatives on men and older women because you want to conserve those O negatives in cases where you have to use them for people who could potentially have children later on in life. So if that's the case, and I don't think anybody wanted to give them anything but O's. A couple people want to give them ABs. You don't want to give AB blood to anybody uncross-matched. Give AB plasma, and of course it doesn't matter whether it's Rh positive or negative because there's no Rh in the plasma, so it doesn't really matter. And then the one thing that we do at Shands, and they do at level 1 trauma centers, is we give A plasma instead of AB plasma when they get it done cross-matched. And if you think about it, about 40-45% of the population is O, 40-45% is an A, so you're getting about 90% of the population compatible plasma if you give them A plasma, and you've conserved your AB plasma. We've had a few that patients come in and they're Bs, but their antibodies usually diluted out. It's not a big deal. Okay. Questions, answers, comments? Yes, sir.
I had a question for the last question on the test, where it was saying if you run out of.
Well, some of you wanted to run out of plasma on the patient, not plasma for units, but okay.
Oh, I thought the last question about if they ran out of blood.
No, it was if you ran out of plasma, but it was okay because you interpreted it. You interpreted it differently. I don't know that you did, but some people interpreted it differently than the question was intended, which was fine because if that's the way you interpreted it, I gave you credit for it because, okay, that was not where I was going, but that works for me. So you're not going to run out of plasma on your patient. You might run out of plasma on your specimen, in which case you get another specimen, right? No big deal. But ran out of plasma, then what do? So you've given them AB plasma in section 2, so what are you going to do in section 3? You give them A. Probably would have given them A first and then gone to AB. But some places will start off with AB.
And that's universal, that they usually just give the A and
no,
O positive to people over 60 and men. Is that universal? Or is that just something they practice like here at Shands or something?
No, it's not solely devoted to Shands. But it is very common in big trauma facilities because you don't want to use up all your AB plasma. We give our AB plasma to our neonates. And because you've got the majority of your people covered by giving A's. And the other part of this is it's not very scientific, but if you think about it, people who've come in with a gunshot wound or a ruptured aneurysm or something, they've already bled out a lot of their antibodies. So if you're putting volume back in and it's not compatible with them because they're a B or an AB, then you may have some hemolysis, but you've probably bled out a good portion of your antibodies. And so it's almost like you've got better things to think about. You've got to take care of reestablishing the pressure and being able to recover, I guess, more than likely. Like I said, it's not very scientific, but you can kind of think of it from that regard that you've got more important things to think about than having an antibody go and react with something. And the other part of that is if you give an O blood, then that A plasma is not going to react with that O blood. So you're pretty much covered except for whatever few cells they may have. And a lot of times they'll come into the emergency room and they don't have much of their own blood by the time they're finished with it. They've gone through a lot. It's nothing to give them, 20, 30 units of pack cells.
So in forensics, you have someone that's obviously deceased and you go to sample their blood and it's a mixed field. How do you go about getting the correct information so that you can continue on?
I don't know that anybody in forensics would ever, well, I guess they would for blood bank, but I mean for crime investigation forensics. I would imagine that in that certain circumstance, you would have to do DNA testing, which you can do, and we have the capability of doing PCR in the blood bank. So if there is a mixed field, we can determine what is the patient's actual genotype. We don't usually do it in that specific arena, but it is possible to do. Okay. But that's a very good question because from that perspective, we have given out specimens for that kind of an investigation before, but usually what they ask for is something pre-transfusion, so we'll go pull the pre-transfusion sample out and give it to them. And so then they know it's pretty clean as far as what the patient's gotten, so that's them. But after they've been transfused, they would probably have to do a PCR on it. Okay. All right, so today we are going to talk about antigen typing, and today we're going to antigen type. But he's so excited, I know, right? So we drew the blood on last Thursday and Tuesday, right? So today we're going to come in and type it, so it'll be good. It'll be good. So antigen typing, just like the anti-A and the anti-B and the anti-D, there's anti-Kel, anti-Big E, and anti-JKB, and all of those antiseras that react with those antigens that we can type our patients for and our donors for. Most of the time we don't do it unless there's a specific reason. I think we have an antibody, so we want to prove it, or we want to make sure that we compensate for it when we are going to give blood. So we have different antigen typing sera that we can use. We can also do the PCR because we do that as well. We can get a better profile of PCR than we can with a traditional antisera. But it's not something that we do every single day on every single patient. Okay, so when we went through our testing protocol, we're building upon our testing protocol. So we started off doing our ABOs and our RHs, and then we did our antibody screen. I don't think anybody had, no, some of you did have positive screens, didn't you? So if you had a positive screen, the next step is to do an antibody identification. And antibody identification is what we're going to do in a couple of weeks, but basically you have that screen and everybody saw the anagram, so we know which cells are positive for which antigens on the 3 screen cells that we used when we have an expanded version. And by virtue of elimination, we can come up with a hypothesis about what our antibody could possibly be. And of course, the reason we know these antigens exist is because people have antibodies to them. So that's how they came into existence. And fortunately or unfortunately, most of the antibodies have names for the people who first demonstrated the antibody. So that's how we have Kell and Sutter and Duffy and all those other groups. And if you guys watch Blood Bank Guide, that's one thing people will say is, I'm going to call it Big K, I'm not going to call it Kell. Well, I've been doing this for 30 years, I'm going to call it Kell. So he can call it whatever he wants to call it. So if we have a positive screen, we're going to do an antibody identification, and that's going to include a panel. It's going to include alternate methods, so warming it up, right? You were warming it up to make sure that we've said, okay, it's going away, we're good. Or put it in the refrigerator, make sure that it reacts, so we know we're dealing with a cold. We can use polyethylene glycol as our enhancement, as opposed to LIS or albumin. Albumin is a good one to use when you're dealing with a cold antibody because it tends to be a whole lot more forgiving with cold antibodies because it's basically just a physical enhancement, not a chemical enhancement. After you do your antibody identification, a lot of times you'll pull selected cells out and you'll continue on. And when we get to that point, you'll find out that we have another rule of 3. Remember, we have the rule of 3 in hematology, we have the rule of 3 in blood banking too. The other thing that you could do is an auto-control. And the auto-control is going to tell you whether you're dealing with an allo antibody or an auto antibody or maybe some element of both. And then another thing you're going to do is antigen type. Be really, really careful when you're dealing with antigen typing. It's a good way to prove an antibody. If the patient is positive for the antigen and you think the patient has the antibody, then you can eliminate that particular antibody in his plasma. But if they're negative, doesn't mean it's there. It just means it can be there. If the patient's been transfused in the last 4 months, you can't use traditional antisera because you're typing the donor's cells as well as the patient's cells. So you really don't have a clear picture on who's positive or negative because you've got both of those dual populations to deal with. Okay, so we're talking about antigen typing. Like I said, we've got antisera for the vast majority of the antigens that we see the antibodies for. There are some that are not FDA approved, so we can use them for research purposes only. We can't charge the patient for it, we can only use them to kind of investigate. And then the other thing is that if you are doing the antigen testing, you have to run controls. So if you look at those screen cells, a lot of times your screen cells can be your positive and negative control because you've got one that's positive and one that's negative. So you're going to run your controls in conjunction with your patient. Be very, very careful, and I'll tell you this now, because different manufacturers are going to have different protocols for you to follow. Some of them are going to be room temperature, some of them are going to be 37. You might have to wash and add anti-human globulin. We had one in a while back, and I think it reached its ugly head again not too long ago, where you incubated it, and then if you put it in the centrifuge to spin it, you would mess it up. So you had to incubate it and then go and read it after the incubation. So, of course, the first thing, what does everybody do when the timer goes off? You grab the tubes and put them in the centrifuge, right? Well, no, if you did that, you messed up. You had to go back and start over again. Another thing that you have to make sure, and I said about the 4 months, but you have to make sure that your patient doesn't have positive direct Coombs. If your patient has positive direct Coombs and you have an antisera that requires washing and adding anti-human globulin, you're going to have false positive. And that goes for donors as well, because anything that you put in that anti-human globulin is going to react if it has positive direct Coombs. It doesn't matter what you tested it with, because it's going to react. Could be positive, could not be positive, but you've got a positive direct Coombs that's interfering with it. Okay, so if you are looking for units, so you've gone through your entire type and screen, you've gone through your antibody identification, you've done your selected cells, you've done your auto control. If your auto control is positive, you've done your DATs, you've antigen typed your patient. So then you want to give antigen negative blood, and in the vast majority of the cases we're going to test our donors. But we want to know how many donors do we need to screen in order to find the number of units that we need to be antigen negative. Take this with a grain of salt, because the estimated percentage of compatible units is just that. It's an estimate. So you don't ever want to have it written in stone. You just want to use it as a guide for you. Okay? Because there are pockets of people that you may know in your head that 90% of the population are KELV negative, but you may go